The Sydney Writers' Festival opens tomorrow, and one of the featured authors this year is Cunxin, whose autobiography Mao's Last Dancer has been on the bestseller list for nearly 2 years. Born into a peasant family in Mao Zedong's China, Li had little prospect of escaping grinding poverty. But a chance in a billion saw him chosen by one of Madame Mao's cultural scouts to study ballet in Beijing. He became one of China's finest dancers and, following his defection to the West, made his name on the international stage. Cunxin now lives in Australia, and this morning we profile his extraordinary life.
I looked out of the aircraft window into the darkening sky. I saw myself as a small boy running barefoot through the commune fields. I saw myself as a Red Guard, and I saw myself once again as Mao's last dancer, endlessly practicing in a dim and dusty dance studio in Beijing.
The reflections of Cunxin from his best-selling autobiography, Mao's Last Dancer, the story of a Chinese peasant boy who wound up on the international dancing stage.
I guess Mao's Last Dancer is one of those books that comes along just once in a while, which is a kind of publishing phenomenon. It's been on the bestseller lists for literally more than a year.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with me.
You're welcome. What's your name? For me to stand where I am tonight was never meant to be part of my destiny. Indeed, my fate was meant to be this poverty-stricken peasant from the day I was born, probably to remain so for as long as I lived, just like my father before me.
Born in 1961, Li grew up in northeast China. It was the China of Chairman Mao Zedong, when the so-called Great Leap Forward resulted in economic ruin for the country and the deaths of 30 million people.
Well, I was born into an utterly impossible situation. We had no running water, no heating absolutely. We were just freezing to death, virtually every night. And no food to eat. So that certain years, tree barks were all being eaten by desperate people in my village. So it was against that kind of background that I was all of a sudden chosen by Madame Mao's people from the Beijing Dance Academy to study ballet.
Even there, it wasn't just, you and you, it was you. And he'd been bypassed. They weren't going to choose Li, as Madame Mao's people, sort of selected people out of the classroom to go and be ballet dancers, which is what happened to him. It was only as they were leaving, his teacher just said to one of these visitors to the school, said, "What about him?" And the person from the government just turned around and went, "Yeah, okay, he can come too." And that was the instant, the moment that changed his life.
Afterwards, when I was writing my autobiography, I phoned her up, his teacher. I said, "Teacher, son, please tell me, why did you ever single me out that day?" And she said, "Li, for all these years I wondered. I still don't know."
The auditions that followed were grueling, but 10-year-old Li knew it was his only chance to escape life in the commune.
Then it was my turn. One teacher lifted one of my legs upwards. 2 others held my other leg steady and straight. They kept asking me if it hurt. Of course it hurt. It was excruciating. But I was determined to be chosen, so I kept smiling and replied, "No, it doesn't hurt," as I lifted my leg higher and higher. Be strong, you can bear the pain," I kept telling myself, and I did bear the pain. But the hardest thing was pretending to walk normally afterwards. They had torn both my hamstrings.
In 1972, Li arrived in Beijing, where he would study ballet for the next 7 years. He desperately missed his family and at first hated dance with a passion.
And I was hopeless. I was a hopeless student these first 2 years. I didn't like ballet until one day this amazing teacher deeply inspired me. through his inspiration, passion for ballet, I eventually fell in love with that art for myself.
I was 16 years old, but I was impatient. Now I raced through my meals so I could get back to the studio to practice my jumps. I woke at 5 every morning. I strapped sandbags to my ankles and hopped up and down the 4 flights of stairs in our studio building. I practiced my leaps, covering every inch of whichever studio was vacant. I was obsessed.
There's one account which has really resonated with me. When he was at the dance academy, he'd get up in the middle of the night, weren't allowed to, but he would sneak up into one of the studio areas, light a candle, and then practice his turns, looking at the candle turning. And isn't that a great image? Can't you just see that?
The Chinese stuff that he did in Beijing Academy was very much based on Russian technique. So when I actually then saw him in performance for the first time, he lived absolutely up to my expectations, and you just knew you had to watch everything he did. Even when he wasn't dancing, your eyes were constantly pulled back to him. So a kind of magnetic presence.
In 1979, Li Xin was offered a scholarship to study in the United States. For the young communist, the West was a shock in every respect.
We didn't speak much of English. That the next morning when we woke up, our host screamed upstairs. We were getting dressed. He was cooking us this first Western breakfast. And he said, "Would you like some English muffin for breakfast?" Now, we understood English and muffin in that phrase. Muffin in Chinese means horse shit. So just imagine you being offered horse shit for breakfast, for the very first breakfast. The thing shocked me the most about America was the freedom people enjoyed there, which I was denied as a Chinese citizen at the time. I truly believed inside of me that if I could have that same freedom that Americans enjoyed, I would be unstoppable in pursue these faraway dreams to become the best dancer I could possibly become.
Li Cunxin, one of the first Chinese students to dance in the United States.
On a second visit to America, Li fell in love with an American dancer. When the Chinese consulate found out he'd secretly married and wanted to defect, he was locked up for 20 hours.
Dr. Arnold charges tonight that a Chinese citizen is being held against his will in the Chinese consulate here in Houston.
Li Cunxin has been dancing.
I was interrogated. My life was threatened. I thought they were going to kill me that night.
Hello, everybody. A dramatic standoff has ended at the Chinese consulate here in Houston tonight. A Chinese ballet student on an exchange program to Houston had been kept inside the consulate.
It took me a while to really sink in. I was truly a free man. I was still alive. I was free to pursue my dreams. And it was just an amazing realization. But then very quickly, of course, I realized I was cut off from China, from my beloved mother, father, my 6 brothers, the people I loved so dearly. They were such a big part of my journey.
It was another 6 years before Li's parents were allowed to travel to America to see their son dance for the first time.
Throughout the entire audience, that my parents were to come. They all lived through my defection. They all understood what I was suffering through for these 6 long years. Eventually, when my parents walked into the theater, the entire audience burst into applause for them. It was such an emotional moment, and only when the applause burst out. That's when I was told my parents had indeed arrived. And the best moment came at the end of the performance. Eventually, when everybody had left and my parents slowly walked forward, my father looked at me up and down and up and down. Eventually, he said, "Lee, why didn't you wear any pants?" The peasant in China had never seen a pair of tights before in his entire life.
For the next decade, Li Xin-sing danced with the Houston Ballet. His first marriage foundered, but 6 years after his defection, he married Australian dancer Mary McKendry.
When I was paired with him, I was thrilled, really thrilled. And of course it worked out beautifully, and we tried to avoid each other in a romantic way because we didn't want to destroy the partnership in the studio, because it's so hard to find that, just as it is in life, I guess.
In 1988, the unthinkable happened. Li was granted permission to visit China. Together with Mary, Li made the journey back to the country he'd left 9 years earlier.
And what did strike me was, how did he get from there to where he is? That was and in the entire 10 days, I think we were there for 10 days, I still could not quite understand how that had all really come about, because it was such a remote little place.
For Li, there were haunting memories.
And there was a cocktail happening right on the Gate of Heavenly Peace, where Mao and the leaders normally appear. Now, in one of the scenes I wrote in my book, I was one of the young guys among millions of kids leaping and hopping and jumping, overjoyed, and tears streaming down our faces, and we just thinking we have seen this divine human being. And I happened to be standing at the very spot where Mao stood, and with a glass of champagne in my hand, looking down to imagining the very spot where I stood as a youngster that day. And you couldn't imagine how I felt.
A dancer can never rest on his achievements for long. By its very nature, ballet is a career with a defined end. Li Xin-sing's last years as a dancer were with the Australian Ballet, but by the time he took his final bow, Li had qualified as a stockbroker. But Li Xin-sing's creative imagination could never be sustained by the stock market. If he couldn't dance, he could write about it. The result, Mao's Last Dancer, has become a fixture on the bestseller lists.
Because it was such a remarkable journey that for me to write of my family history, probably made me come to terms with certain aspect of my life, especially my harsh childhood. And those, in fact, those sad memories, at the end, after I finished the book, I thought they were truly became part of my strength, really, become part of my motivation.
I thought of my journey towards the most precious thing I had, my freedom, and of what had always propelled me forwards, my father's pride and dignity, and my mother's extraordinary courage and unlimited love.
Catherine Hunter produced that report on a remarkable life. The readings by Jason Chong. Coming up